Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive historical paradox. We're looking at why the very treaty meant to secure lasting peace after World War I actually ended up being the main catalyst for the deadliest conflict in human history.
So how exactly does a peace agreement spark a global catastrophe? Well, let's jump right in and trace this terrifying domino effect of unintended consequences. We usually think of a peace treaty as the definitive end to a conflict, right? But what actually happens when a treaty is built almost entirely on vengeance instead of actual resolution?
Part 1. The Flawed Peace Treaty. The Seeds of Conflict Sown in 1919.
All right, so let's look at the infamous Treaty of Versailles. It officially ended World War I, sure, but it placed these unimaginably heavy burdens on Germany. This was largely driven by Britain and France, who, understandably, wanted to recover their own massive war losses. But the absolute kicker here is Article 231. The War Guilt Clause. This didn't just punish a government, it humiliated an entire population. It basically forced everyday citizens to shoulder the absolute, complete blame for a global war, totally ignoring the roles of other participating countries. Unsurprisingly, it quickly became the world's most hated treaty.
And to make matters even worse, Germany was slapped with a $33 billion fine. To put that into perspective, in today's money, you're looking at roughly $270 billion. Plus, their incredibly resource-rich coal regions just handed right over to France. This financial burden was so completely staggering that Germany literally only made their final payment for this debt in the year 2010. I mean, think about that. It took almost a full century just to pay it off.
Part 2. Economic Collapse and Humiliation. The devastating real-world impact on the German public.
So, when you strip a country of its resources and force it to pay an utterly unpayable debt, the financial system doesn't just struggle, it completely breaks. Let's look at everyday survival. In just one single year, the price of a basic packet of bread in Berlin shot from 160 marks to an absolutely incomprehensible 200 billion marks. This kind of hyperinflation literally wiped out the entire economy overnight, leaving the general public completely destitute.
And then, of course, the Great Depression hits in 1929, taking things from really bad to an absolute nightmare. By 1933, you have 6 million Germans out of work, people were losing their homes, children were literally starving in the streets. You've got this deeply fractured, utterly desperate society that is practically begging for a savior. Basically, anyone who could promise them a return to some kind of national pride and basic stability.
Which brings us to Part 3, the exploitation of anger, weaponizing public outrage for political power.
Enter a young political leader named Adolf Hitler. He looked at this massive nationwide distress and essentially used it as a stepping stone. He realized, quite shrewdly, that the public's intense hatred for their international humiliation was the ultimate political weapon. Actually, he attempted a coup in 1923 that failed, but bizarrely, it ended up massively boosting his popularity with the masses. Fast forward to 1933, and he completely manipulates the emergency powers of the Weimar Constitution. He sidelines the president, entirely dissolves the democratic process, and just declares himself dictator, all under this new mantra of one nation, one leader, one ideology.
Once he had absolute control, he weaponized that public hatred of the treaty to a horrifying degree. He deployed this incredibly intense propaganda machine to scapegoat Jewish populations and minorities, actively blaming them along with so-called anti-national socialists for Germany's entire downfall. He pushed this completely fabricated Judeo-Bolshevism conspiracy theory and became obsessed with building a racially pure Aryan empire that supposedly needed Lebensraum, or living space. This unchecked, rampant hatred is exactly what paved the way for the horrific, systematic atrocities of the gas chambers and the Holocaust. The terror was so immense that brilliant minds like Albert Einstein literally had to flee the country just to survive.
Moving to Part 4, Tearing Up the Rulebook, Systematically Violating the Treaty of Versailles.
So with absolute power secured, Hitler just starts aggressively tearing up the treaty's rulebook. And the European neighbors? They largely just stood by and watched. Despite incredibly strict international laws forbidding it, he rapidly builds up this terrifying modern military apparatus. He expands the army way beyond the 100,000-man limit, secretly creates a brand new air force called the Luftwaffe, and starts churning out fleets of U-boat submarines. And all the while, the international community is just scrambling to appease him. France was actually so panicked, they went ahead and built a massive 450-kilometer defensive fortification called the Maginot Line. The dominoes are absolutely falling now, driven by these unchecked territorial grabs. He kicks things off by annexing Austria completely without bloodshed, just using internal pro-Nazi infiltration. Next, he sets his sights on the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. This is where British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain steps in with a heavy policy of appeasement, signing the Munich Agreement to hand over this land, just to get a promise of peace. But, you guessed it, just months later, Hitler completely shatters that fragile peace and invades the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway.
Which leads us to Part 5, the inevitable war. The failure of appeasement and the dawn of a new military terror.
The ultimate breaking point finally arrives in September 1939. Hitler secretly coordinated a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union so the two of them could jointly invade Poland. With nearly 1 million German troops suddenly pouring across the border, Britain and France finally woke up to the fact that appeasement had permanently failed. War was officially declared. And to conquer his neighbors, Hitler unleashed this terrifying, totally unprecedented warfare doctrine onto the world stage: the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. It was meticulously designed to make conflicts as short and as devastatingly decisive as possible.
Here is how this completely reshaped combat. The tactic relied on flawlessly executing precise, sequential steps. First, heavy tanks just smash through defensive lines at blinding speed. Almost instantly, the Luftwaffe is right there, providing this overwhelming continuous bombardment from the sky. It leaves the enemy with absolutely zero time to think, let alone react. I mean, opponents like Poland, whose army astonishingly still relied pretty heavily on cavalry and horses, were just utterly decimated by this highly modernized, synchronized terror machine in less than a week. Now here is a wild, often overlooked detail. To sustain this superhuman lightning pace, the soldiers literally had to be pushed way beyond natural human limits. So what did they do? The German soldiers were heavily issued a fatigue-suppressing military drug called Pervitin. Today, we know that exact substance as crystal meth. This drug completely suppressed their hunger, their thirst, and importantly, their need for sleep. It allowed German troops to fight continuously, day and night, for days on end, while the defending armies desperately had to stop and rest. This combination of unnatural chemical speed and incredibly highly coordinated strategy allowed the German army to pull off a massive trick on the Allies during the Battle of France. They sent these huge distraction forces, Groups B and C, right toward the Netherlands and the heavily fortified Maginot Line. Meanwhile, the actual master plan, Group A, snuck a staggering force of 40,000 military vehicles straight through the Ardennes forest. Now, French military experts had confidently assumed this densely wooded area was completely impassable for tanks. They were wrong, and because of that, France fell in a matter of weeks.
This brilliant yet absolutely terrifying maneuver famously ended up surrounding and trapping 400,000 Allied troops right on the beaches of Dunkirk. This sparked Operation Dynamo, which was this incredibly desperate sea evacuation using everything from naval vessels to tiny civilian fishing boats to rescue 350,000 soldiers under heavy enemy fire. But out of this near-total catastrophe emerged a new British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. He galvanized a very shaken world with a legendary defiant speech, making it crystal clear that the free world was not going to back down.
And that brings us right back to our central theme, leaving us with a really profound question to think about. We've just seen exactly how economic ruin, desperate populations, and ruthless opportunism can spiral completely out of control. It really forces us to look at the immense danger of humiliating an entire nation in the name of peace. If the victors of World War I had focused on genuinely rebuilding rather than relentlessly punishing, could the absolute horrors of World War II have been prevented entirely? It's something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the history you think you know.